I will now turn it over to our lovely speaker, Kim Kakakaway, of Away Home Canada. Kim, over to you.
Everybody, or good morning, at least from where I'm situated. I don't know where everybody exactly is from, but I'm excited to be here, and I want to thank Tiffany and the team for inviting me and for supporting me through this webinar. My name is Kim Kakakaway. I am Cree and Saulteaux Cree from Red Pheasant Cree Nation and Keys First Nations. In both are located in Saskatchewan. However, I am currently living in Treaty 7, Calgary, Alberta, which is where I have been calling home for many years, have grown up here, and am privileged to live on this Treaty 7 territory. A little bit about me. In my career, my heart, my passion has always been our Indigenous people, where my especially our young people, our youth, whether I've worked with people on reserve, off reserve, and just kind of different areas throughout Canada and the United States. But my heart, my passion has always been to work and come alongside our Indigenous people and to build the community up and to invest and to pour back in. I just think there's so many beautiful aspects of our communities and where we come from, and so that's kind of where my passion and my heart has always been, and I think will always be in wherever I land, whatever situation I'm in, to advocate and to speak up for our people in many areas. I've kind of landed within the homelessness sector through working with Indigenous youth over the last 8 years or so. And that has also become my passion in advocating and speaking up and trying to challenge different systems and bringing our Indigenous people up to the table. And so as we go through today, please feel free to ask the questions in the chat, and to know that this is just a small part of many things that we can talk about when it comes to our Indigenous people who are homeless or houseless. And so just barely scratching the surface here, but excited to jump in. Next slide, please. I want to kick off with talking about the definition of Indigenous homelessness. This was created by, together with Jesse Thistle and the Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness. And to me, this definition of Indigenous homelessness really hits spot on. What it talks about is it's understood through a composite lens of Indigenous worldviews. So looking at individuals, families, and communities that were isolated from their relationship to land, water, place, family, kin, cultures, languages, identities. And people experiencing these kinds of homelessness cannot culturally, spiritually, emotionally, or physically reconnect with indigeneity or lost relationships. This is so huge, and the key word being relationships. We know that due to colonization that has happened to Indigenous people worldwide, we have always been connected to land, to water, to place, to family. And so when we're looking at what does homelessness mean for our people, that it is not just this physical structure. It's not just a home and that four walls, roof, whatever that might look like in there, but it's so much more than that. Indigenous homelessness is how we have been isolated from those relationships to the land, to the water, to our family, to kin, to our relationships to culture and to animals in many ways. We often know that the first thing that was taken due to colonization here on Turtle Island in North America was land. And that was kind of where I always like to say that in order for us to really tackle the root of homelessness in general, we have to start with our Indigenous people, because that's where homelessness first began, was with our people, because as soon as our land was being taken, then it slowly made its way through other components. And so I encourage you, to look up the definition of Indigenous homelessness. There's a full breakdown that you can find on the Homelessness Hub website. And I know after this recording, there will be a link that IGH will send out, and I will include the resources where you can find some of the things that I talk about as well. Next slide, please. Really briefly, I'm going to just go through some of the statistics. We know that with our Indigenous people, especially here in Canada, the stats are always the highest. And I usually don't talk about the stats because we often seem to be the highest rate of suicide, of diabetes, of health, of the justice system. And the homelessness count is the same in that sense, in that we are often seen as higher within that rate. And we know it connects back to the impacts of colonization. But looking at these stats really quick, 5% of Canada's population identifies as Indigenous. And within that, because I work with you, some of my content might be focused a little bit on our Indigenous youth, but 30.6% of those identify as Indigenous youth, homeless youth. And then 55% of individuals who are Indigenous first experience homelessness as children or youth. And that is extremely high. And that's why I think it's important that we continue to talk about and educate about our Indigenous people and the impacts, and how is it that we can support our people moving forward? How is it that we can bring supports that are culturally relevant and that are actually meeting the needs of our Indigenous people in a different way that has been systemically done up to date. Next slide, please. So one key component that we need to talk about is the impacts of intergenerational trauma. We know that, again, going to the definition, that this is kind of where homelessness began, was because of colonization. And with that comes the impact of generation to generation of traumas that has been passed along. We've had residential schools here where it really dismantled our family systems. We know that there was a lot of abuse, neglect, experiments being done on our people, and isolation. Culture was basically illegal within to do anything. Practicing our language became a punishment, and taking our land, our resources, and really putting us in a place where our people were starving. There was disconnection and isolation to the land, to the water, to the place, to the animal. What we once had, where we thrived, we lived off of our relationship to the land prior to colonization. That's how we survived. We were very resilient prior to colonization because of how we knew how to navigate living off of the land and be able to sustain and thrive. Prior to colonization, we were not lacking or missing anything. We had seamstress. We had in today's words, I guess, we had the seamstress, we had the engineers, we had the carpenters, we had the doctors, the nurses. We had all of that prior, just in a more traditional way, and using the resources that the land had been providing for us. So when colonization came, that's when the residential schools were mandated. And that's when 60 Scoop also came about, where, you know, our children were removed from our families and were sent literally all across the world, saying that we were not fit to be parents, that we were not fit to care for our own children. Therefore, they took our children and put them in other homes, which today is still an ongoing impact of people who are trying to connect and find their families and who they are and where they come from. So that intergenerational, if you look at the residential schools going to, you know, that next generation, where we've never been given the tools of how to feel safe when we have been coming from that dismantled family systems due to colonization. And if you look from generation to generation, how are we providing opportunities of healing in culturally relevant ways? How are we providing opportunities for our people to connect and to learn who they are? Because you know, there has been a loss of language, but we are seeing this new generation and our youth today reconnecting and finding that again. But that impact of generation to generation has been very real in how and why we see high rates in health and injustice and within the homelessness sector because of the impact of colonizations. Addictions comes from the impact of colonizations. We are constantly up against systemic racism and racism in general to this day, very much in this sense, has been a big challenge. On top of that, below there on this slide, you're going to see also generation to generation that not only has the traumas been passed along, but so has the strength and resiliency of our people. And that is something that we need to remember and something that I always want to highlight because we are often seeing or what is often highlighted is the negative of our people instead of the beauty and the value and the strengths and the resiliency of our people, and how through the impacts of the residential schools, of the extent of abuse and trauma that had happened, and in many systems, very much even to this day, that we have held on to our culture, that we've held on to our language, that we have held on to our practices and the beauty and our strengths. We've held on to the traditional teachings or traditional songs, traditional way of doing things in that way. And that has also been passed on. And oftentimes with our people who are on the streets, our relatives who are on the streets, they have been told that they are nothing from society. Our people in general have been told that we are nothing from society because of ongoing stereotypes and racism. And so part of when working with our Indigenous people is remind them of who they are in their strengths, remind them of who they are in the value and the knowledge that they have. And that's why one key component is helping them connect back to who they are and where they come from. Who is their family? Who is their home community? What is their language in that way? Because those are all components of healing and supporting and looking at not only, yes, there's intergenerational trauma, but there's also that intergenerational strength and resiliency and values that our people carry. You know, they talk about blood memory and how it's very real in that the things that have happened with our ancestors in the past, that has changed some of our DNA in that sense of trauma in a way, but so has that strength and that resiliency and the beauty that our people have is also blood memory, and something that I always want to highlight and make sure that we bring that to light, because there's so much more and so much value that our people, especially who are unhoused, don't see within themselves. And when you don't see the value in something, you often don't take care of it. You don't highlight it. You don't see it as something important. And so when we change that mindset of something of value, we start to treat things differently and in a better way. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about kind of four key areas really quickly in a sense. I'd love to dive deep, but that can be maybe for some other time. But four key areas that I want to chat about are prevention, compliance versus relationship, the fragmented systems, and determining success. Next slide, please. So prevention, we have built systems more comfortable responding to breakdown than investing in the prevention of it. Prevention is so important. It's moving from focus on the emergency crisis response and putting more focus and resource towards the prevention to avoid the emergency response that's even needed. We know that a lot of dollars can go within such emergency responses. And when we start looking at prevention and dealing with things earlier on, we catch things before money is spent on the crisis. We try to prevent people even from hitting on to homelessness and on those streets. Early intervention is focusing on our young people and our youth, or even earlier. It's focusing on our families as a whole. How are we working with our families from preventing even going into the child welfare system? How are we preventing them from ever experiencing homelessness at any point in time, as we have seen stats that 55% have experienced before the age of 25. Prevention work looks like working within the schools. How are we catching them before they leave, before young people leave care? Looking at different housing initiatives like Housing First for Youth. I'm currently looking at Navigate, or just kind of working more within the Housing First for Youth sector and bringing in those Indigenous lens of what does that look for Indigenous people from that Housing First perspective. In that way is we need to catch our young people a lot earlier before even hitting the streets, and providing supports to our families and the young people in many different ways. Next slide, please. Compliance versus relationship. So we know, again, going back to kind of that definition of Indigenous homelessness, is that relationships has been one of those most important things, because of prior to that, when looking at homelessness, it was the isolated relationship to land, family, kin, people. So compliance versus relationships is we need to change the checkbox items that systems often require and bring within our Indigenous people and what they actually need. What systems often ask is, did they show up? Did they fill out forms? Did they provide ID? Did they meet the criteria? But what our people need first when working with Indigenous people is we have to prioritize relationships. We actually need to build trust first. We have to build relationships, the flexibility in time, safety, to be honest, to show up. And to have connection. That connection is important. It's our identity. Our people are trying to find out who they are due to colonization, the 60s scoop, being removed from their homes and their families. Therefore, we need to make connections, and that starts with trust and relationship and time and safety. We need to prioritize that when looking at this systemic level. Not having strict timelines and the criteria that we often put more weight into. We need to prioritize the relationships in any of the work, because we are relational people. That's where we come from. When you think about our relatives who are on the street, they have a street family, because street family is very real, because there's connection that they have there. So when we are working with our people and we are looking at how are we supporting them, how do we get them from here into housing or to find the supports, we have to have wraparound supports in many ways. And so if we're removing our people from their street family to get them to a physical structure, I'll say, into a home, we have to also connect them to a community and a family. And so we can't just put them into a house and be like, you're housed, we've accomplished our goals, we've done what we needed, now I'm going to move on to the next person, and leave them hanging there when, if they're isolated, they have not been connected to a new community or a new family. Then that way, if they're not connected, they're going to go back to their street family. And that's very much the reality of our people, because relationship has to be prioritized in any way, because that is who we are. We're very relational people, and it's about connecting to the land, family, place, in all that those areas. And so what our people need is compliance versus, I mean, is the relationship over compliance that we often see within current systems in today's. Next slide, please. Fragmented systems. So we don't experience life in categories if you think about it. Many things happen in our lives at the same time. But oftentimes within the systems our people are trying to navigate, they can be very siloed. Our houseless or homeless people or relatives are expected to move between systems that often do not talk to each other while somehow holding their lives together within the gaps. If you think about it, you have the Indigenous people in the center, and we often hear that when people, when organizations or systems are working within the homelessness sector, they have the person in the center and they provide support from out there. But when each of these systems are not communicating with each other, what we are doing is we keep asking our people to share their story over and over and over and over. And that is what is creating more trauma for our people, because we keep saying, tell us our story, your story, how can we support you? And if you're not providing all of these resources or have already built relationships with each of them to make the system more seamless for our people, it's going to create a more healthy system for our homeless people in general, whether Indigenous or not, to navigate a lot more. Oftentimes we have really intense intakes and assessments to determine where they're needed. But once we have those systems in place, we don't necessarily refer them in a seamless way. We make them have to tell their story over and over again and again to get the service in each and every system that they have to navigate. They're leaving the justice system. They're trying to get education. They need housing. They have mental health, the health system. If you think if we have built relationships with each of these systems and knew how to coordinate better, then I think it could really help prevent our people from falling through the gaps, because that's what we often see, especially within our Indigenous people. Because when we haven't had a voice for so many years due to colonization, sometimes it's hard to find a voice within these different systems. And that's why the relationship is so important. And so when I talk about relationship, it's not just building relationship with the people that you serve within our Indigenous communities. It's also building relationships with the Indigenous-led communities and resources where they can provide those culturally relevant supports if you don't have those. It's building relationships with all those other systems so that our people are not falling through the cracks, because we have often seen that so much. We also know the fragmented system comes from lack of funding for our Indigenous people on reserve, and in communities. We don't get as much funding as mainstream education, for example. We often get less funding in many ways. And there are many different colonization impacts that comes around that, and even on reserve and how systems work on reserves and in that area. But coming back again to relationship isn't just about one-on-one with the person, the Indigenous person that you are serving and building relationships. It's also relationships within the systems that you are currently working with to help support from a more holistic lens within our people. Next slide, please. So determining success. What does success look like? So the question is not only how do we help our people navigate systems, but how do we change the system that makes impact of what matters? Some of these current systems are only creating generational cycles by creating more barriers rather than truly addressing what matters. We need to redefine what success looks like. Currently, we know that the systems have funding requirements. There's often measurements, which is very much a reality. We're tracking what are the appointment attendance, how many housing our housing placements, discharge targets, program completions, where those are important and play a key role. We don't look enough at what matters of safety over time. What are those healing opportunities? What are the connection and cultural belonging? And are our voices being heard and our youth voice? Because we come from very much, again, relational community sense. We have been very hurt within many systems, and trust isn't there. And so if you want to look at what are those long lasting changes that our Indigenous people need, is we need safety. We have been up against these systems, up against abuse, against mistreatment from many different forms. And so that cycle continues, right? We have systems in place that have re-traumatized our people because of the lack of support or the lack of how they have done this in many ways. And so I think, how do we start looking at what matters in the sense of healing, and truly looking at how are we supporting our people, as instead of a quick checkbox item of they attended this appointment or that appointment, or they got housed in that way, how have we connected them to healing opportunities? How have we taken the time to get to know them first, so that we can really support what it is that they need beyond housing? Because when working with our people, again, it's not going to just be a physical structure. We have to look at their spiritual components. We have to look at, yes, that physical structure as well, but we have to look at the emotional capacity. All of those areas are how we support and work with our Indigenous people, because the physical structure will not bring end homelessness. You have to provide those wraparound healing opportunities from that intergenerational trauma, and bring in teaching opportunities, bring in the connection and those cultural connections, reconnections, if that is helping them find their families if they've been disconnected, or finding new families, as I had mentioned before. Imagine if we prioritize what matters and then brought in system measures after that, and what attendance, housing placement would look like even after that, once we provide what matters in that sense. And timeframes, that's a big piece in this factor of, oftentimes there are short timeframes of we need, and due to funding, which I understand, but again, it comes from the systemic issues in that way of, having a 6-month timeline isn't going to be successful, in the sense of having no timeline of how are we looking at safety over time to make sure that they are safe, so that we can have them get out of survival mode, so that we can provide opportunities to teach life skills. When you've never been housed because you've been a survivor of residential schools, and then your kids have been taken away, and then they're in child welfare, you're constantly been in survival, and you've been never taught how to raise a family. How do you have life skills in that sense? And so having the time to be able to do that in healthy ways and in culturally appropriate ways are so important, across the board, in any which way of what we're trying to bring and support our Indigenous people. Next slide, please. Really quick, in 4 ways to transform systems. One, again, relational practice, and I'll always talk about the relationship in any work I do, because that's the most key. Is fun time to build relationships, reward consistency over compliance, and train staff to see the survival, not the resistance. Oftentimes, if you think about it, when you're people in survival and they come to you for services, the mental health might be bad because we've been in survival for so long. We might come across as being angry or this or that, because we have come up against system versus system versus system, but haven't been able to be heard in many ways. We haven't been able to sit there and to heal and to grieve over what has happened up to this date. Our people have tried to navigate each system and might have experienced racism along every step of the way. And so when they come to you, they're frustrated and they're mad. Um, and it might come across as, oh, they're the angry native or whatever that looks like, but that's not the case. It's because we have been in survival mode. And how are you as an organization, as a support, showing up different than any other system that our people have been up against to this date? How are you showing up in a safe way, in a supportive way, in a culturally relevant and safe way as well? Second thing is redefine success. Again, that's measuring safety, what we just talked about, cultural belonging, bringing our voices to the table is so huge. Oftentimes, our people are asked after the fact on our opinions or on our voices. Oftentimes, you are not seeing our people in leadership um, levels, no, on boards, in decision making positions. We have had the decisions made for us or on our behalf. And so inviting us to the table, whether on the street or off the street, that doesn't matter, but bringing our voices to the table. Let us make the decisions of what we know is right for our own people, is so important. Funding prevention. How are we looking at our young families and supporting them as a whole? When working with our Indigenous people, you can't expect us to work with one person alone. You always have to include their siblings, their cousins, their family, because our family dynamics are viewed differently. And so when looking even at funding, we have to, I think, include bigger funding amounts, because when working with one person, we can't silo them. We have to work with their families as a whole. Whether, and it doesn't have to be blood family, it's their chosen family. Again, who their relationships are, is because that's what's going to take them in the long run, as how we're connecting them to family who are safe and good. Funding youth who, before they even age out of care, how are we preparing them prior to even landing on the streets, because they haven't been prepared if they've grown up in the child welfare system their whole lives. How would we catch young people who maybe are couch surfing and they're not showing up in school? That's prevention, is when we're in the schools, we can identify that and flag those people and start supporting them before we completely miss them and they fall through those gaps. And then a shared accountability. Again, that comes to how is it, as each of these systems, we work together so that we prevent the gaps. We all have shared accountability and working together as a whole, that it's not just going to be a housing sector that's going to work. It has to also be the health, the justice system, the education system, everybody working together in order for our people to really succeed in many ways. Next slide, please. So how do we wrap around our Indigenous people? We know that what has affected our people has been the trauma or the intergenerational trauma, the loneliness, the lateral violence is very real within our own communities against our own people, which comes from survival mode within a colonized system. How are we calling each other out as Indigenous people as well, and working and committing to our own healing as Indigenous people? We know the what has affected our people has been the disconnection of culture, of identity, ongoing effects, colonization, broken systems. But what our people need is having systems, families work together, opportunities for healing. That's so huge in many ways. Opportunities for healing can mean connecting to land, because again, it comes back to connection and relationship. But it's being intentional and connecting to land and to the water. It's getting connected to our elders, it's getting connected to mentors, back to culture, ceremony, whatever that looks like for that individual. It's getting connected to culturally relevant supports in counseling. There's non-talk therapies that are available now that are safe for our people to go through. How are we looking as reminding people of their worth, knowing that they are someone, because often society has put our houseless, homeless relatives down to say that you are nothing. But when they show their worth, when they know who their worth is, there's a different light that ignites within them. But how is it that we are showing them their worth, their strengths, and their value in many ways? And then the last slide here is what I would like you to leave here with is advocate from frontline staff or those who are in the field working with our people, is advocate from the inside, from that systemic level, about prioritizing relationship, prioritizing those resources that are holistic, that are not just about housing and physical structure, but that are focused on reconnecting, connecting back to the relationship, to the land, family, water, kin, animals, all of those things that we had stated on that first slide. Name those gaps, document what the relational work actually looks like and produces. The policymakers in the government fund prevention, require cultural safety as a condition of funding, not as a checkbox, making sure that everybody is trained in how to work with our Indigenous people. What does that look like? What does that mean? What have the actual impacts of colonization been on our people? That it wasn't something that happened a long time ago, but it's something that is very real today, here and now. And listening to our Indigenous voices and making space for us at the table. And to our Indigenous community, that our presence and your presence in these rooms are not optional, that they are essential. To use your voice to find it and to continue to work on our own healing and our own accountability, and to bring together our young people and these next generations who are going to be our leaders, and continue to leaning into our culture, to the language, to the community events, to the arts that are out there, because we are alive. And even though, yes, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma, there's so much else intergenerational strength and resiliency and worth and pride that our people have, and holding each other accountable and putting to rest the lateral violence that is also within our community, because we have enough people and things coming up against us that we shouldn't be turning on ourselves in that way. And that's where a lot of healing comes from. And the last slide, and that's it. In many ways, and I know I've flown through this very quick, and again have just scratched the surface on so many of these components that we have talked about, but ultimately there's a lot of deeper things to dive into throughout, and there's different trainings out there. I know I provided a whole 2-day training that just kind of talks deep dive in how to work with our people within this sector, but I hope that you walk away with some tools, but just know that those key things, components are how are we looking at those relational pieces, and not just looking at that physical structure when working within our sector, but we need to look at connection to all of those other components. And so thank you for listening and taking the time today, and happy to take any questions that you have or anything.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was such a great presentation. It was so informative. You touched on so much. I don't even know where to start, but I love how you highlighted the resilience alongside the challenges. I love how you highlighted the need for tailored support. I love how your recommendation of people making equity a requirement, because that is like a next step to accountability. But yes, it was just so informative. Thank you so much. Um, I'm gonna see if we have questions in the chat. Let's see. Okay. One question we have is what will cultural safety as a requirement look like for implementation?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. A lot of it is going to come from there's trainings out there that are available for cultural safety specifically. And one thing I would say is that it needs to come from somebody who is Indigenous led, Indigenous communities in that way. And oftentimes, what I would say is, what does that look like as a requirement? Is mandating it as if it was a first aid that you mandate to work with the people that you're working with. Because when you're looking at cultural safety, you're understanding what different family dynamics look like. What does things look like from a cultural perspective? Because we're all looking through our own lens at the end of the day, right? And so when we're working and alongside our Indigenous people and we don't have training on what understanding an Indigenous lens looks like, how do we know how to support them? And so when we're mandating cultural safety, we need to look at what are those cultural safety trainings and supports look like from an Indigenous person. And that's the key component is someone who comes from that experience, someone who's grown up in that lens to know this is how to support our people. This is what it looks like in that way, and mandating it for every single person so that everybody's on the same page of how is it that we can understand them better from their lens to best support them, and that it's not just an optional training or an optional thing that is often the case this day and age.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Lived experience is the best, um, most important way to learn how to care for people experiencing homelessness. I think we have another question, and sorry, I haven't been able to see the chat to pull questions out of there. So if you did put a question in the chat, if you can put it in the Q&A section of the menu, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Um, we have another question. Um, Dan Jones, hi Dan, is wondering if the impacts of the climate crisis are disproportionately affecting homelessness among Indigenous communities.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Currently, there's a lot of fires happening here in Canada, and um, there's communities being wiped out, because of the global crisis, I would say, on the environment, the impacts on the environment, and the fires that are happening, and what communities are doing. What we're seeing slowly here is the government and environment specialists, I don't know the proper language, sorry, but are even connecting with our Indigenous people to know what are the best actions moving forward to prevent some of this going forward, because we have always been the caretakers of the land from prior to anybody else coming here. It was us, and how we are caring for it year round, and what does that look like. But when these disasters happen, it's our people who are being wiped out, and we're being evacuated to centers, being removed for our homes, where our homes are not being rebuilt for whatever reasons, or our people are being sent to these main city centers because they're being evacuated, and they get lost in these systems that they've never navigated before. Therefore, then they end up on the streets, homeless, being lost. If there's addictions in many ways, and they're more at risk. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and people is also very real. And so then they're more at risk when you're being displaced from your home into a center that you're not familiar with. Your safety is a lot higher risk, and we are always a higher target than anybody else because of our vulnerability. And so it's that question alone is so layered, but there's absolute impact on our people because of the impacts of the environment and the fires and disasters that happen because of the displacement that happens with them.
Thank you so much. That was a great question and a great answer. I think we might have time for one more. Okay, no, sorry, that's we have people wanting to connect with you. Hi, Rob. Um, let's see. Oh, wait, this might be one more question. Okay, given that there's a desperate need for a global definition of homelessness, what are your thoughts on the need to include Indigenous voices within the definition, the global definition of homelessness?
Absolutely. It it should only be Indigenous voices doing the global oh, sorry, I was looking Indigenous. Okay, no. Yes, absolutely. There has to be Indigenous voices within that. And I would say, yeah, I would love it if it was just only Indigenous people there, but that's no question that definitely there needs to be. And I would say from different areas. I think there's commonality of Indigenous people on a global scale for sure. Therefore, I think it needs to be Indigenous voices on a global scale that need to be sitting at that table. Mhm.
Thank you. I think um, let's see. I think we have. There may be questions in the chat that I didn't get to, but I'll be sure to try to um, incorporate them somehow, or maybe if I can get answers to those questions from you and put them in the follow-up, we will definitely try to do that. But I think we will try to wrap up here. Thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today, for sharing all your insights. This was so informative. Um, it's just, I don't even know. It's just so much that was in your presentation. You just hit on so many great points. I think it's so relevant to the global landscape, even across the most marginalized groups across the world or other marginalized groups. I think everything that you explained is relevant to those groups as well. And I think the strategies and the approaches that you discussed too can be adapted to those groups and those regional groups as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. Everybody, just be on the lookout for our follow-up email with links to resources, to the recording of the webinar, and we'll also put Kim in touch with people who are asking for your contact information. So thank you. And thank you everyone for
Thank you.
joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you, Tiffany and IGH. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.